Republicans on Capitol Hill quickly getting in line behind the new president. Tuesday's election also helped the GOP maintain control of both chambers of Congress. A top priority for lawmakers and the new president will be health care. Trump and Republican leaders are now preparing to repeal the Affordable Care Act.
After a tough campaign where people believe that they were pitching so hard from one side or the other, the time is to heal and to unify. This health care law, Charles, is not a popular law. This health care law is collapsing under its own weight.
It's a pretty high item on our agenda, as you know, and I would be shocked if we didn't move forward to keep our commitment to the American people. It was the single worst piece of legislation among many bad pieces of legislation.
With me now to discuss all of this, two of our best MSNBC political analysts, Ron Reagan and Hugh Hewitt of the Salem Radio Network. Nice to see both of you. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Kristen.
Hugh, I want to start with you. We have heard Donald Trump say a number of times on the campaign trail that one of his first priorities is going to be to repeal and replace Obamacare. We all remember how challenging, how long the process was to actually put it in place, to get it passed. So what does that look like? He has majorities in both chambers. How quickly could this happen? How difficult will it be?
I think reconciliation is a device that will allow it to move fairly expeditiously. Coming up with the replacement will be a little more complicated, Kristen. But I got to say, I think Obamacare premiums and deductibles arriving on dining room tables across the country, along with Secretary Clinton's ethics problems, drove this election, especially in my home state of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I just learned just before I came on that for the first time since 1928, Trumbull County, Ohio, where I'm from, voted Republican. It went red for the first time since 1928. I think that's Obamacare. I believe it's a steel town, it's an automobile town, it's a union town. I think that's Obamacare, and I think the need to move quickly is indeed intense.
But Hugh, let me follow up with you on that point, because you say that the repeal part might happen very quickly, but the replace part, that's the challenge. The president himself has said, hey, we put something in place. It's not perfect. Let's take this piece of legislation. Let's make it better. If you scrap the whole thing, Hugh, what happens to the 20 million people who now have health care? And don't we just see premiums and everybody's health care prices go way up?
No, I've talked to people like Avik Roy and other specialists. There are a lot of things that can be done which are not have anything to do with Obamacare, including a national marketplace, which the president-elect has talked about, including making sure that you do keep pre-existing condition coverage. You may keep people up to 26 on their children's plans, but lower it. Mostly you've got to change the benefits mix. You've got to make a national market. You've got to provide for health savings accounts. They will replace it with something. It will be a negotiation. They have a few months to get it done.
Hugh, what happens with those people during the negotiations? What happens to the 20 million Americans who now have health care, who didn't have it before, during those negotiations, which you and I know all too well can stretch out over months, if not longer?
Oh, I think it's going to be much quicker than that, but you don't repeal Obamacare until you have something to replace it with. And it might involve some transition for people at what I call the edge of Medicare or the edge of Medicaid if they have been expanded too quickly or too rapidly. But what's more important than the 20 million people who might be marginally impacted in a transition period is the hundreds of millions of people who can't afford the collapse of the American healthcare system, which is ongoing and rapid.
Ron, I want to turn to you now and talk about this extraordinary day here in Washington. And one of the components that makes it so striking is that there are so many GOP senators who are in competitive races who distanced themselves from Donald Trump or denounced him. Kelly Ayotte, Joe Heck, Mark Kirk, who lost on Tuesday. But the ones who are going to be with him, Pat Toomey, Roy Blunt, Richard Burr, how does he work with them? How do they say, hey, look, we didn't mean all of that. We're ready to work with you. What's your expectation?
Well, first of all, shame on them. They should have meant it. This is a very disreputable character that is now our president-elect. We have never had somebody so unfit and so unprepared to be president as president-elect. Donald Trump. So, you know, these people, the Republican Party and the individuals in the Republican Party who backed Donald Trump, despite what we know about him, despite his boasts about assaulting women, despite his obvious ineptitude, his inability to string two sentences together regarding any policy proposal. The people who backed him are covered in shame now. And now they've gotten what they wanted. Now they've got at least 4 years of Donald Trump. As to the Obamacare, if I may
Sure.
comment on Obamacare, You know, Hugh Hewitt neglects one thing. Hugh's a very bright guy, and I enjoy listening to him, but he does neglect one thing here. Obamacare is the Republican alternative to what really is liberal progressive health care, which is a universal single-payer plan, which is what the rest of the world does very successfully, I might add. I spend a lot of time in Europe here, and they're baffled by our inability and unwillingness to adopt a sort of welfare system kind of scheme for our medical system. So you're absolutely right. What do you do with those 20 million people who are going to lose their medical care? Hugh talks about what a disaster Obamacare is, and then he starts citing all the things that are good about Obamacare, like the fact that pre-existing conditions are no longer something that gets you kicked off of your insurance. Well, that's going to come back. That's going to come back when we turn this back to the insurance companies, let them run the show, let profit-making corporations who don't care about your health care run our health care system again. That's what you're going to get. So I hope we're all happy about that.
Ron, you make such a really interesting point, and I have to let Hugh respond to it. What about that, Hugh, that this wasn't actually what the Democrats wanted? They wanted a single-payer plan. And by the way, Donald Trump says he likes a whole lot about Obamacare when you break it down to what he's actually saying.
Well, I was proud and still am proud to have served Ron's dad in the White House counsel's office under Fred Fielding. And I believe what his father believed in, free markets for free solutions. He would never have adopted the British health system, which is failing massively. It does work if you've got an extraordinary amount of money and very few people. We have got a lot of people and very little money. We have to innovate. We have to be open to new solutions. I want to say, though, I am with President Obama and Secretary Clinton on the rhetoric that ought to be greeting Donald Trump, not with Ron Reagan's rhetoric. We have always given new presidents a honeymoon. I gave President Obama quite a lot of grace when he came in at the beginning, and I really think the protesters last night and commentators ought to be saying, we know we didn't like him, we didn't want to vote for him. Let's now join together and hope that he does good things, although stand ready to criticize when warranted. I really do think we've got to back off until February and March off of this left-wing constant barrage on Donald Trump. He won. They lost, to quote President Obama. He gets a shot to lead.
Actually, he lost the popular vote, Hugh, as you know. And speaking of honeymoons, what happened when Barack Obama was elected president in 2008? On his inauguration day, Senate Republicans got together and agreed that they would simply oppose anything he tried to do. Anything, even if they agreed with it,
and I don't
because they wanted him to be painted as a failure.
I don't expect Democrats to go along with this legislative, but on the last Wednesday of his presidency, George W. Bush had I and 5 other talk show hosts to the Oval Office to ask us to give the new guy a chance, and we did. We didn't like his proposals.
What did Mitch McConnell say when Barack Obama was inaugurated? He said that we would oppose everything he tried to do.
Well, and to be fair, some of that rhetoric did really set in after the actual inauguration happened. Hugh, your thoughts about that and how the birther controversy, which was put to rest before Election Day, how might that impact this meeting? Will either of them bring it up? Should they?
I can't imagine it. I believe that Jonathan's completely correct. This will be a meeting between presidents in a very small club. One's a president-elect, one's a president going out, and they tend to treat each other with the deference that they understand, at least remotely, on the part of Donald Trump, who has not yet experienced the office, is overwhelming. I will point out that Donald Trump has a very unique position in presidential history. He's arriving without a prior member of his party in support of him. So whereas 43 could call 41, and 41 could call President Reagan, and President Reagan could and did call President Nixon, and Bill Clinton could call Jimmy Carter. This president-elect Donald Trump, was not supported by any prior president. And of course, Secretary Clinton could have called her husband. And so he has a somewhat lonelier entry into the White House because he's not coming in with anyone, as Nixon did, would call Ike, and as Kennedy did during the Cuban Missile Crisis, would call Ike. So hopefully the former President's Club, which is all male, as was pointed out, will rally around and put aside the partisan rhetoric that dominated the streets last night and realize that rookies in that job, no matter how confident they are, find moments and need invitations to talk it through with people who've been there and done that, and there are very few who have.
What a fascinating point. Ron, I want to bring you back in on that point that Hugh makes, which is such a really interesting point, that he doesn't necessarily have this group of people around him that he can readily reach out to. and talked to about this transition. Talk about how important that has been in the past and how we might see that at work right now.
Well, the presidency is not like any other job. This is an awesome responsibility that Donald Trump is taking on now, and it brings you face to face with the reality of the world in a very, very stark way. There is no really preparing for the presidency as such. You can't practice being the president, being the governor of a large state, like my father was governor of California for 2 terms. That's a big deal, and that does prepare you for being in an executive position like that, but it is not the same as being president of the United States. You do need, it is helpful to talk with, as Hugh said, people who have been there before, people who've been there in the building, who know what this is all about, who have felt that kind of responsibility before. And it is telling, it is striking that no former president is backing Donald Trump. Donald Trump is about to get hit in the face by responsibility and reality like he has never seen before. He's going to get an intelligence briefing now that is a real intelligence briefing, not the sort of one that they give to the candidates and all, that's a more general sort of thing. He's going to get read in now, and the fantasy bubble that he's been living in, you know, the one where Barack Obama isn't really an American, and, you know, the whole country is collapsing and you can't leave your house without getting shot down in the street and all that kind of stuff. The reality is going to arrive at his doorstep. And it's going to be striking for him. It's going to be bracing for him. And it's going to be a very interesting thing to watch him as an individual grapple with this and assume this responsibility, this awesome responsibility like nothing he has ever experienced before.
And as we watch the Trump motorcade departing from Reagan National Airport, heading here to the White House, we are reminded of what President Obama said yesterday and his own transition. The fact that former President George W. Bush made the transition for him incredibly smooth, gave him all of the information that he needed. Hugh, what are your memories from that moment, and how might that inform this transition that we are about to witness, which, as President Obama said yesterday, he and former President George W. Bush didn't agree on a whole host of issues, but that transition set the tone and set the tone for the country.
George W. Bush was so gracious and set an example that I'm quite certain President Obama will follow. The man is a good man. I don't agree with him on anything, but he's a very good man, and he will follow that very good man, George W. Bush's approach. The only transition I actually experienced firsthand was that from President Reagan to President Bush, which was as seamless as a transition could be. President Reagan had, Ron's father had mentored George H.W. Bush, but there was some tension between those George H.W. Bush people who wanted to come in and clear out the desks. It's actually a little bit more difficult to go from Republican to Republican sometimes than Democrat to Republican. But I expect the best of both men from now through the inauguration. And then the the fisticuffs will break out pretty soon after everyone is sworn in and the Capitol is cleared. But until then, I really hope we focus on the fact we're all Americans, and the peaceful transition of power is the great glory. It's a cliche, but it's the best cliche we have.
Oh, I think all of us couldn't agree with that statement more.